The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Water streamed down the rusted warehouse gates, turning the asphalt into a dull mirror. Detective Pierce stepped out of his car, collar pulled high against the cold wind that smelled of salt and rot. The sign above the door read, Harrington Logistics, Unit 12. Fire department pumps were still humming in the background. Sergeant Brooks met him by the entrance, soaked to the bone, fatigue showing in every movement. Floods about knee-high inside, Brooks said over the noise of the pumps. Found him this morning. Doors were locked from the inside. Pierce switched on his flashlight and stepped into the dark. The beam caught floating debris, bits of cardboard, plastic wrap, paper swollen with water. In the middle of the warehouse, a steel shelving rack stood half submerged. On the lowest shelf lay a man's body. Work uniform, pale face, hands folded neatly over his chest. Like someone had carefully placed him there. Name? Harry Clark. Night guard. Cause of death? Medical examiner says drowning, Brooks replied, uneasy. But the water wasn't here when he died. Pierce's eyes moved along the wall. Fresh scraped marks around a drainage grate, the bolts still wet from being turned. Near it, footprints in the mud, heavy boots. They led to a maintenance hatch and vanished under the water. Pierce turned on his recorder. Case file, flooded warehouse, 1 deceased. Victim positioned deliberately. Possible third-party involvement. Next step, verify who had access to drainage controls and building keys. He clicked the recorder off. The sound of the pumps faded for a moment, replaced by a low, hollow clang echoing from somewhere deeper inside. Like metal brushing against metal. Pierce froze. Waited. Then stepped forward, water rippling around his shoes. The flashlight beam cut through the dark and landed on nothing. Just a slow rise of black water. By the time the body had been taken away, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Detective Pierce stayed behind, standing ankle-deep in the murky water, his flashlight sweeping across the concrete floor. The drainage grate caught his attention again. The bolts were too clean, no rust, no grit. Someone had loosened them recently. He crouched down and ran a gloved hand along the edge. The metal was slick, but beneath the grime, he could feel faint scratches, like someone had tried to pry it open in a hurry. He pulled out his phone and took a few photos. The flash illuminated something that made him stop. Just beyond the grate, trapped between the bars, was a scrap of dark blue fabric, a torn piece of uniform cloth. He looked back toward where the body had been. Harry Clark's shirt had been light gray. Pierce exhaled slowly. That meant someone else had been down there. Later, in his office, Pierce played the warehouse security footage on his old monitor. The camera feeds were low quality, grainy and washed out by the rain, but he could still make out the outline of the warehouse interior. He scrubbed through the timeline. Midnight. Harry Clark enters from the north door. He walks his usual patrol route, flashlight in hand. Nothing unusual. He checks the lock on the front gate, then disappears off camera for several minutes. Then, a second figure appears. Tall. Wearing a hood. No face visible in the shadows. They move toward the back wall, crouch down near the drainage area. And the feed cuts to static. Pierce leaned forward. The timestamp read 12:14 a.m. When the footage returned, Harry was lying on the ground, motionless. The hooded figure was gone. He paused the tape, staring at the frozen frame. The light from Harry's fallen flashlight reflected off the water pooling near the drain. Something about it seemed strange, too much shimmer for a shallow puddle. He jotted in his notebook. Drain, possible tunnel? Access point? Verify old sewer maps. The next morning, Pierce met with the city maintenance department. They pulled out a faded set of blueprints from the 1970s. According to the plans, the warehouse sat above an unused service tunnel, once part of an old stormwater system that had been sealed decades ago. Officially sealed, the clerk said, tapping the map. But we've had complaints, flooding, noises, even rats. Nobody wants to go down there. Pierce nodded slowly. He already knew his next step. That night, he returned to the warehouse alone. The air was heavy, damp, thick with the smell of stagnant water. He unscrewed the drainage bolts, set the grate aside, and pointed his flashlight down into the opening. A narrow shaft led several meters below. At the bottom, standing water, maybe waist deep, and a narrow passage leading into darkness. Pierce climbed down the ladder, boots splashing as he reached the bottom. His breath echoed against the wet stone walls. He turned, light cutting across the tunnel, and froze. There, pressed against the far wall, was another security uniform. No body. Just the uniform, soaked and empty, hanging from a nail like someone had left it to dry. The air in the tunnel was thick and cold, heavy with the smell of rot and rust. Pierce's flashlight flickered over the hanging uniform. Drops of water ran down the sleeves like sweat. It was impossible to tell how long it had been there, but the fabric looked newer than it should have, not yet stiff with mildew. He stepped closer. The name tag had been ripped off. Only the faint outline of where it used to be remained. Pierce reached out, lifting the collar. Inside, a small metallic glint caught the light, a badge pin, bent out of shape. He turned it over in his gloved hand. Stamped into the back were faint numbers. 47B. He frowned. Harry Clark's badge had been 38D. Someone else from the same security rotation had been here. And they hadn't logged a shift in months. Pierce slipped the pin into an evidence bag and turned his light deeper into the tunnel. The water rippled slightly, though he hadn't moved. He waited, listening. Drips echoed down the corridor. Then, another sound, faint but distinct. Footsteps. They were soft, slow, deliberate. Coming from further down the passage. "Police!" Pierce called, his voice carrying through the damp air. "Identify yourself!" Silence. Only the steady, rhythmic drip of water. Then the footsteps stopped. He scanned the walls, graffiti, rusted pipes, moss. The tunnel split ahead, two directions, left and right. A gust of cool air blew from the right-hand passage, carrying the faint smell of something chemical, fuel, maybe. He followed it. The tunnel widened into a larger chamber. Floodlights had once been bolted to the walls, now shattered and useless. Broken pallets floated in the murky water. And in the middle of it all, a generator, half submerged, cables snaking up into the darkness. Pierce waded closer. The generator looked recently used. Fresh oil clung to the surface. On the ground beside it lay a soaked clipboard, pages fused together by grime. He peeled it open. The ink had bled, but one word was still legible on the top sheet. Shipment. He turned the next page. A list of serial numbers, handwritten. Each one carefully crossed out, except the last, #0721F. Pierce's flashlight beam flicked across the room again. Near the back wall, just above the waterline, he saw a large metal crate, military grade, marked with the same number. He stepped closer, boots splashing softly. The latch was already broken. The lid hung open. Inside was no weapon, no cargo, no evidence of smuggling, just a thick layer of mud, slick with dark water. He leaned in. Something was sticking out from beneath the sludge. A hand? Pierce staggered back, heart pounding, then forced himself to look again. The fingers were pale, waxy, and unnaturally stiff. He knelt and carefully brushed away the mud until the face appeared, eyes open, mouth slack. Another security guard. The missing one, most likely. Water sloshed quietly as he stood up. The drain system hadn't just flooded, it had become a burial ground. He reached for his radio, but before he could speak, static erupted in his earpiece. A faint voice broke through, distorted and distant. "Detective Pierce, can you hear us?" Then silence. Just static and the faint echo of his own breathing. Pierce looked toward the tunnel he had come from. The water there rippled again, more violently this time, as though something large had moved just beneath the surface. He stepped back, gun drawn, flashlight trembling slightly in his other hand. Then, a dull clang rang out, the sound of metal striking metal, from deeper inside the tunnel system. And the water began to rise. The water was climbing fast. Pierce turned toward the tunnel he came through, but the latter was already half submerged. The current was pulling toward the back of the chamber, dragging debris and oil slicks with it. Somewhere deeper inside the system, a valve must have ruptured. The drains were filling like a tomb. He holstered his gun, slung the flashlight between his teeth, and started climbing. His boots slipped once against the wet metal rungs, but he forced himself higher until his hands gripped the edge of the shaft. The sound of rushing water echoed beneath him like a beast inhaling. He pulled himself out just as the chamber below vanished beneath the rising flood. For a moment, Pierce just stood there, drenched, breathing hard. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the sudden surge of adrenaline. He could still hear the echo of the clang that had started it all. That wasn't a pipe bursting. It had been deliberate. Someone was still down there. Back at the precinct, hours later, the evidence spread across Pierce's desk told a story that didn't add up. The badge pin, the empty uniform, the crate, they all tied back to the same logistics company, Rydell Freight, a name that had come up before in smuggling cases that never led to convictions. But this time, something about it felt different. Cleaner. Organized. He flipped open a file. The missing guard, Leon Hart, last seen 2 weeks prior. No record of him quitting, no note, no complaints. His paycheck had been deposited as usual right up until the night before he disappeared. Someone had been keeping the illusion of his employment alive. Pierce rubbed his eyes and leaned back. Outside, dawn was beginning to lighten the city skyline. He stared at the rain-streaked window and whispered, almost to himself, "What the hell were you guarding down there, Leon?" By afternoon, the lab report arrived. Traces of industrial solvent in the floodwater. A mixture often used for dissolving metal plating, the kind found on shipping containers. Someone had been trying to erase evidence, not hide it. Pierce called into the site, ordering the area sealed off. When the response came back, it made his stomach twist. "Sir, that won't be possible. The warehouse, it's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" Pierce demanded. "Flood damage, sir. Structural collapse overnight. The whole floor caved in. The city already started clearing it." Pierce stood in silence for a long time, gripping the phone. He hadn't been gone 12 hours, and yet, every trace of what he'd found had been washed away. That night, he drove back anyway. What remained of the warehouse was just twisted metal and shallow pools reflecting the moonlight. Police tape fluttered weakly in the wind. The drain system had been capped, sealed with new bolts that shone under his flashlight. But something about the water caught his eye, a shimmer, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't reflecting the moonlight. It was glowing from beneath. Pierce crouched down and dipped a gloved finger into the puddle. The glow clung faintly to the surface of his glove, pulsing once before fading. He stood up slowly, eyes scanning the wreckage. Then he saw it, footprints. Bare, wet, and leading away from the collapsed site. They trailed across the concrete for several meters before vanishing near the fence. Too large to be Harry's. Too recent to be Leon's. Someone had walked out of that flood. And they were still out there. The footprints led away from the ruins and into the marshland behind the docks. Pierce followed them carefully, his flashlight cutting a thin, trembling path through the mist. The city lights behind him faded until all that remained was the sound of insects and the faint slap of water against mud. The prints were irregular, sometimes dragging, sometimes sharp and deep. Whoever had made them was barefoot and injured, but moving fast. Pierce crouched to examine one. The edges were still wet. Whoever this was, they couldn't have been more than an hour ahead. He drew his gun and moved deeper into the reeds. The smell of the sea mixed with something chemical, industrial runoff, the same stench that filled the warehouse tunnels. The ground sloped downward until he reached a shallow clearing where the water pooled in dark, shimmering patches. That was when he saw it, a cargo container, half buried in the mud, its side door hanging open. The number stenciled on it matched the file from the clipboard, #0721F. Pierce stepped inside. The beam of his flashlight revealed rows of stacked crates, most of them smashed open. Inside each, there were fragments of what looked like metal casings and melted components. It took him a moment to understand what he was seeing. Hard drives. Hundreds of them, stripped, dissolved, destroyed. He knelt beside one of the crates. The smell of acid burned faintly in the air. These weren't normal data storage devices. They were industrial grade, military spec, meant to survive heat and water. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure they didn't survive this time. Pierce lifted a small fragment, its surface corroded but faintly marked with a serial code. When he wiped it clean, he saw it clearly, property of Rydell Systems Intelligence Division. Not freight systems. The company wasn't shipping goods, it was erasing something. A rustling sound broke the silence behind him. Pierce turned sharply, gun raised. In the doorway stood a figure, soaked, barefoot, eyes hollow and unfocused. The uniform shirt clung to his frame, torn and discolored. For a second, Pierce thought he was seeing a ghost. "Leon Hart?" he said quietly. The man blinked slowly. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. His voice was low, uneven, like it hadn't been used in days. Pierce took a cautious step forward. "What happened in that tunnel?" Leon's gaze flicked toward the crates. "They told me to guard the shipment. They said it was just tech waste, nothing dangerous." He paused, trembling. "But the drums started leaking. The air, it burned. It burned inside." Pierce frowned. "Toxic waste?" Leon shook his head. "No. It wasn't chemical. It was data." Pierce stared. "Data?" "They were testing something," Leon said, voice cracking. "Not just deleting files. They were dissolving records, digital, physical, all traces. People, transactions, names. They said once it was gone, it never existed. But it doesn't stop. It spreads." He pressed a hand to his temple, grimacing. "I can't remember what my face looks like anymore. I tried to leave. They wouldn't let me." Pierce took another step closer, but Leon backed away. "I stayed down there too long," he whispered. "It's in the water now. It remembers. It's—" His words cut off in a violent shudder. His knees buckled, and he fell forward into the puddle at Pierce's feet. The detective knelt to check his pulse, but his fingers met only cold skin. Leon Hart was dead. Pierce stood there in silence for a long time. The rain had started again, light and cold. It washed over Leon's still body, rippling across the surface of the flooded floor. Then, faintly, the puddle began to glow, the same pulse of light he'd seen at the warehouse. He took a step back. The glow spread through the water, faint but deliberate, like a current tracing unseen circuits beneath the surface. It moved toward the crates, through them, until one of the ruined drives sparked briefly, then went still again. Pierce's radio crackled suddenly at his belt. "Detective Pierce, come in." It was dispatch. "Sir, are you still at the warehouse site? We've received a call from your number." Pierce froze. His radio was off. The voice was coming from his other pocket. He reached inside slowly and pulled out his phone. The screen glowed faintly despite being powered down, the signal bar flashing in rhythm with the pulsing light around him. He stared at it, heart pounding. Then, softly, a voice came through the speaker, distorted, wet, mechanical. "Detective Pierce, the record is incomplete." The call ended. Hours later, the cleanup crews arrived. They found no sign of Leon Hart, no trace of the container, and no standing water, just an empty field of wet mud and a single notebook lying open in the dirt. Its last entry read, "The shipment wasn't cargo. It was a deletion. And I think it's already working.